For years, restoration professionals have operated without a true federal identity. While the work of emergency response, structural drying, microbial remediation, fire and smoke cleanup, and contents restoration, all the things you do yourself in the industry, they become increasingly specialized. While the industry itself remains buried inside government classification codes designed for construction or waste management. Do we belong there? Well, that may soon change. Our guest today on this episode of RIA Beyond will tell us all about it. Darren Hudima, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Pleasure to be on board and to be able to share some updates and basically what you just described. What is it? What are we doing? And where are we going?
So tell us about your involvement with today's topic. And I guess my first real question is that most restorers have probably never heard or thought about the NAICS code. Why has RIA invested so much time and effort into this code, and what does it really mean?
It's been recognized between the IICRC and the RIA is that there's been a lack of a code that is specific to our industry. So because we are in cleaning and restoration, some of the codes that get identified to us, there's not anyone that is actually specific to some of the things that we do within the industry. So I get a number of phone calls, especially being the director of training for PureClean, where we have new franchise owners, such as we've got going on right now in the class, where now they are applying for insurance and general liability, et cetera. And one of the first questions they get asked is, what NAICS codes do you fall into? What kind of work are you performing? So some may do janitorial. Well, there is a code for janitorial. Some may do carpet cleaning. Well, there isn't necessarily one for carpet cleaning, but it goes to the janitorial. Some may do fire and water. Well, that depends if we do mitigation or not, or reconstruction. So if we end up in doing reconstruction, well, there's a construction code that they get put into that one over there. If we do mold remediation, well, that gets put into a hazardous code over here, which has usually led to asbestos remediation, which also has higher risks than what we do for mold remediation. And so all these different codes essentially start to affect business owners in the type of insurance they get, the cost of the insurance they get, the workers' comp that they end up having to also get for their employees. And essentially those insurance costs either go like this or they go like that, depending on what code you get put into. And then because of the emergency restoration side of things, there is no specific code. So it doesn't matter what is it that happens. It's a hurricane, heavens forbid, all the wildfires that we see actually, in fact, happening right now. Now it's leading to all kinds of fire and smoke remediation. Some of them may only be smoke cleanup. Doesn't involve the actual reconstruction phase. But because of the hazard that's involved and its associated fire, we get put into a NAICS codes that ultimately is putting us at a higher risk because of what so-called health effects could be an exposure, let alone that we wear the proper personal equipment, et cetera, et cetera. So to answer your question, the IICRC and the RIA recognized that we needed to do something. And through conversations, what do you think about the idea that we should actually apply for our own NAICS code? Well, that only happens about every 5 years that you actually get the opportunity to apply, which right now that window is open and they're looking to look at new industries, et cetera, when it comes to those particular NAICS codes they might award based on a specific industry. But that gets awarded in 2027. So we've made the application with the help of the RIA as the leader as an association for the industry. That responsibility kind of falls on them. As a board member, brought it to the IICRC and said, this is really important. I think the IICRC should also get in line to also help drive this in a parallel motion. So IRA is this way, IICRC is this way. What IRA is going to do and the advocacy behind it and the application, IICRC will follow along and help support the initiative. So now basically where we're at is two important entities that have some cases the same memberships, whether certified firms, restoration companies that go and put their technicians through certified firms, but also the RIA has also got a membership based on the owners and various individuals that have joined the RIA to become a member to take advantage of their benefits. So now here we are now, applications gone in to hopefully get a code that affects the emergency restoration side of the business only.
That sounds like a hot mess.
There's a little bit of work that's been involved in it. Fortunately, I've not had to do it by myself. A task force was put together, and that task force included myself, Vince Garfo, Mark Owens, John Isaacson, Wyatt Cox, Alec Freed, Brian Edlin, Vince Brockman, and the RI CEO at the time, Christy Cohen, Daniel Knights, that's on the RI staff, and some others also involved, from Holly to James Toll, now current president, chairman of the IICRC. Robbie Bradshaw was also a part of this before he decided to take an opportunity and now has been replaced by a new gentleman by the name of Phil. But now he's also a part of this task force to keep the momentum moving forward and what the directions are going to be based on the response we just received within the last week and a half from the OMB.
So as it is right now, this misclassification issue, how does that affect our visibility, credibility, and the ability to advocate? It's hurting it, isn't it?
This is a really important factor for a lot of different reasons. So when we look at the restoration companies today, looking at the classifications that are currently out there. So because we do fire, flood, mold, we could fall under a NAICS code which is 236 for construction of buildings. Water extraction, microbial mitigation, odor control can get lumped into a NAICS code called a 562910, which is remediation services, but is a code also built for a Superfund and hazmat cleanup, not disaster response. So then we look at that. Neither one of them necessarily capture a technician who gets dispatched within hours to stop a water damage from becoming a mold damage. So this wasn't a quick ask. It became a optional busy work where now we're looking at, okay, so the ECPC owns and publishes the criteria that requires any code proposal in the document, needs to be now detailed, a specific production process to it and skills that make the industry distinct, its relationship to existing 6-digit codes, the hard data to help identify what the size and growth of the industry is, and whether it also receives or needs recognition within Canada and Mexico, because those codes essentially affect North America, which is Canada, United States, Mexico. So now we look at the RIA's NAICS codes. The task force basically now spending a lot of time to build the case, which was over a year to build that case. And then the task force, in its first meeting, worked on the name, which ended up becoming Emergency Mitigation Services. And then the group flagged that a consultant would be needed to weigh in before that became final to get their input, because they know what the system is when it comes to working with governments and entities. Their review came back with real data and established that 41 restoration RFPs nationwide, showed clients that actually called this emergency restoration services. Task force then scoped the proposed code. And what's common across the industry, rather than overlapping the various codes that already exist for asbestos abatement, carpentry, reconstruction, and then put together the formal request, which ended up becoming the NAICS 624-231 Emergency Restoration Services that went to the federal government in February of 25. Is part of the 2027 NAICS code review. So why this becomes important is that owners should care because the demand that this industry needs to answer when it comes to the enormous and growing size of our industry. Well, NOAA, for example, which is a governmental entity, recognize that there's over $27 billion in weather-related disasters in 2024, and that's just the United States alone, and water damage primarily being one of the primary factors. The highest volume as far as peril when it came to homeowners in filing claims cost insurers over $13 billion in that year. And then we look at all the other data that comes together, flows into single authoritative governmental entities, figures that essentially determines what the restoration industry size is, what's the size of the number of businesses out there, split across all these different codes, construction to waste management. So now take a slice of the data and then look at the estimates of the industry size, ranging from maybe 7 to 200 billion. That's not rounding the air, but it's ultimately helping us to see what the federal statistics may actually, in fact, be that they're now missing. So take all of that. Well, the numbers are actually starting to get bigger because this is what they looked at, but they're not showing the true size what the industry is. And now we're starting to recognize, all right, limited data was maybe why they're not considering why we need a code and assigning a code. So that goes to some other factors that we'll probably end up discussing as we move forward here.
So we're talking about a real identity, recognition, and all that. So talk a little bit about two things for us here, Darren. The safety factor, what this means for, because you mentioned technicians going out on the job, they might face mold or other issues. There's also drug scene cleanup and all that. So the safety factor, but also opportunity when it comes to the industry. What does all that mean?
So again, when it comes to health and safety, there are certain protocols that the industry has written for our industry that's specific, first and foremost. Whether it's mold remediation or fire remediation, there's standards that have been written as to how the work needs to be done, that health and safety protocols need to be put in place, and every company needs to recognize that their prime directive when it comes to their employees is first and foremost health and safety. Well, how important is that? Well, OSHA, which most of us follow here in the United States, up in Canada, they don't necessarily use OSHA, but they have a body, whether it's Health Canada, that is very similar to OSHA here in the United States, or provinces that are using very similar language in worker compensation factors that become important to how our employees do business and the health and safety of those said employees. So now it comes back to, well, these NAICS codes affect our employees directly, because providing for their health and safety, if that NAICS code is not in the right category, it's going to drive the business owner's insurance in a certain direction. It's either going to be up because of the risk codes that they've assigned us to, and the work that's performed by the employees out there in the field. So now it comes down to a number of other factors. We now just determine, okay, why has the NAICS code become important? Well, it starts to look at, well, first of all, the credibility of the industry, the size of the industry, the number of restoration companies, and there's over 66,000 within the United States based on data that this could potentially affect. Well, it's not just the owners that this affects anymore. Now we start looking at, well, who are all the entities that potentially own some of these companies and how it affects them? We have a large amount of private equity firms now that own some of the national companies across the country, into Canada, some now work in Mexico. Now it not only affects the maybe executive team of those large entities, but as a private equity group, as owners, how does it affect them? How does it affect the properties that now they own a restoration company that they've gone and put out and work on their buildings, and then all the employees it potentially affects with the buildings that hit them with specific disasters related to fire, water damage, hurricanes, tornadoes, or anything else. So this becomes a much broader factor when you start looking at all the buildings that are potentially impacted. When we can get all that data, and when you think about what the data is that we get from Verisk, the data that we can get from Cotality, that now tell us how many claims, 2.7 million claims a month or year. Now those numbers all start to magnify insurance rates based on the work that's being performed. So all of that now starts to encompass, well, the cost of doing business. And everybody pays attention to one thing when it comes to doing business. What's on the bottom line? P&L, profit and loss. If I have the ability to affect that P&L at some point, well, is it in insurance rates? Is it the way our employees are doing work and out there that's healthy and safe? The equipment and tools that they end up utilizing, or the codes that are saying, oh, this is really hazardous and drives this up. It now affects not just the owners, it affects the business owners, the entities that own those companies, the buildings they're working with, and well, it just keeps expanding. And the web now is trying to show OMB, the Census Bureau and body, and everybody else that's a part of making this decision, just how big we are and just what kind of an impact it is.
Okay, so a lot of work, a lot of details, maybe some confusion as we dig into this, but let's talk about the future. All the things you're doing, the committee, all the names you mentioned, if this code is ultimately approved, what does it look like down the road? Success, what does that look like?
Well, essentially what that ends up doing is, first of all, you're looking at creating visibility to the disaster response. So based on the research that RIA has done and IICRC and looking at the Emergency Restoration Services Code, they are now looking at the factor of creating awareness, also looking at all those that are part of the recruitment process and helping to drive the message. So looking at trade school partnerships, the apprenticeship fundings that we look at as we start developing potentially technical academies to create a career track. What is this job? That's the question that needs to be answered now, is what is this job? What does it involve? What are the risks? And then the investment that now comes in place. What's the investment? So we start looking at the investors, the financiers, the franchisors, the franchise owners, the lenders that are potentially impacted because they're all shareholders of your company. Now we start looking at this. We're trying to not guess the size, we're trying to determine the size, make sure that we got the right data when it comes to what code we get put into. Is it construction, waste management? Well, those don't make sense. And then estimating from the total amount of business, is it 7 billion? Is it 200 billion? Now we look at the insurance pooling. Well, how does that affect? It's now looking at liability insurance. It's looking at the workers' compensation insurance. And so now ultimately getting it approved, what does that success look like in 5 or 10 years from now? So when we start thinking about things, as this week's Federal Registry notice passed out on July 13th, the specific code that the RIA has applied for wasn't a part of the ECPC recommended code for 2027. So now we look at what's the honest framing is less when this gets approved, or what will still be needed to build forward and why this fight isn't over. And then the industry, how do we respond? We're waiting. What can they do to get involved? So now at least to another point. So now it's second honest note, which ultimately is looking at what's the RIA's own internal risk assessment to this. So not just the RIA, but IICRC. So approval alone doesn't just flip the switch. Based on the decision right now, realizes that the switch may not potentially get switched to a code that affects us. So NAICS, basically the codes are self-selected. So a restoration company has to actually, or industry, choose. So we've chosen that. Now, once that primary code exists and enough of the industry needs to get involved, what is involved when it comes to data before tax records, safety statistics, becomes meaningful not only for the RIA, but also for the IICRC. So when we flag this as a main risk from the start, the benefit then now becomes real, but gradual, and then depends on the sustained outreach of both the restoration firms, federal agencies, and not just change the rule, but it possibly influence the rules. So now we start looking at 510. Federal agencies, insurers, prime contractors, public treating restoration as its own recognized profession, the facilities, the property counterparts to the NAICS 624230, emergency and other relief services, which have already existed before disaster relief to people. We now look at them, we determine the workforce, we determine all the other factors and decisions that need to be made. Oh, SBA is also involved in all this because they base on size of standards and they look at the setting aside of eligibility reflective of restoration firms and what it is they're going to do. Open funding that's now coming from federal. Basically, it's also looking at federal disaster response to contracting companies with a misclassified general contractors code or something else. Now we build stronger cases for wages, career paths, investment in trade, data that finally becomes described as an industry that actually does exist, and then one that is a multi-billion-dollar industry and deserves its primary code. Say that 3 times backwards.
Well, the point is, this is important. This is a very important topic that we hope happens in 27. And if it doesn't, I suppose the work continues. But right now, it's in the system. Talk about, in conclusion, those watching this, those reading the article that goes with this interview, can see what they need to see, review it, and comment on it.
So now we're in a spot where we understand where the OMB ECPC is. And now we need the industry to get behind the IICRC and the RIA. So when we look at that, we've received a letter that this is now open for comment from the industry. So what does that look like? Well, we have till August 12th to submit comments based on what the OMB's final decision could be. But it's not happened yet. So they're open for comment. So now, what are 6 things that we can do? 1, know the number. The number 624231 under the classification of emergency restoration services. When it's published, plan to adopt it as your primary NAICS code. The whole effort only works if the industry actually moves together in alignment with what we're trying to accomplish. What also is important, get your safety house in order. So keep clean OSHA logs, track your TRIR, and then look at the day we have the code that you qualify for the industry standards. Data depends on the records that you now keep today. Get involved with the RIA and the ISCRC's advocacy in what's actually in fact happening. Talk about it amongst the industry and your peers in the industry, your competitors in the industry, because this affects them. And then 5, this one becomes important, submit a comment. And the exact way to do so, and you're going to see some press releases within the day that are going to go out to all the industry magazines, social media, and emails from both the IICRC and the RIA, and they're going to give you specific language to use it. And what becomes important is that now what we're going to send out to the industry is only as good as who gets involved. But those comments are now going to go to regulations.gov. Search for docket number. If you got your pens handy, but this is going to come out in all the notifications that are going to come out as a broad campaign within the next 24 hours or so. The docket number is USBC-206-013, Statistical Policy Directive number 8, North American Industry Classification System. That's what NAICS stands for. Proposed updates for 2027. I know that says a lot, and it's probably more than anybody was able to write down. Don't worry, all of this coming your way by the RIA and the IICRC through emails, so watch for your emails, but it's also going to come out through CNR, R&R, Clean Facts, social media, so that you all know what to do. And there's going to be links that you can click. It's going to send you. You can now get the download of what the letter is, some additional information that you can use to make it your own. And then basically, one thing we're saying here on camera, emailing the OMB or the census directly does not count as an official comment. It has to go through the regulations.gov to enter the docket. So we just can't go and email a bunch of government entities and officials. It's got to go to regulations.gov to be a part of the docket that they're considering the comments for. 6, spread it beyond your own crew. So case in point, this isn't an independent ownership issue. This reaches the national brands, ServPro, PureClean, Belfor, BMS Cat, Blue Sky, Rainbow, Restoration One, Polygon, and I can go down the list, Voda, you name it. If you're in the restoration industry, this applies to you, but not just the restoration company. This also extends to the private equity firms with ownership in the stakes in this space. Why? Well, companies like Blackstone, American Securities, etc., it affects them because they are part of ownership. It affects the buildings that they essentially send restoration contractors to. They also have vested interests in the assets of their properties. So it's also important to them. So they need to get involved. And when you start looking at the portfolios of some of these private equity companies, they are far reaching and involve a lot of governmental entities that they do a lot of work with because they own a lot of real estate in Canada, the United States, and in some cases, Mexico and other countries that maybe the NAICS codes don't affect accordingly, but they still have a significant influence. So owners, employees, investors, equity holders all have a reason to comment. And the reason is the same one. The industry doesn't have accurate data about itself yet. So if you're going to submit a comment yourself, email either Vince Scarfo at the who's the RIA's Director of Advocacy and Governmental Affairs. His email will also be included in some of the notifications that are going to come out, but it's vscarfo, SCRFO at restorationindustry.org. And RIA is tracking how many members actually file, not just how many say they will, how many actually in fact do. So we need all your help. We need it as a collaborative effort, not just the restoration contractors, independent, national companies, all your owners, equity firms, whoever's involved. Your comments are now going to become important to determine the size of our industry for them to make a decision based on factual data, which has also been pulled together and is also going to be included in the press releases that are coming out and the notifications you're going to get from the ISUC and the RIA.
Well, Darren, thank you for this. There's a lot to do in a short time, so we'll get this information out there and wait for those official press releases and all the information you mentioned, names, emails, links. As I gather those, I'll put those below the video in the description as well for easy access. The more that see it, the better the results. Thank you.